that we had not finished the presentation last time because it was more subject material than we had time to present. And when Sikorsky was unable to do this PDM due to a scheduling conflict, we decided to finish what we had started. So last month, we talked about project definition. We talked about the project team. Then we talked about the project plan, and we said the plan should include a baseline, which includes a project scope statement and WBS, a project schedule, which we didn't talk about, a project budget, which we didn't talk about very much. And that is all on YouTube, and I will send a hard copy of this to everyone. I'll send one to Ken, so he has it, and everybody who signed up through the New Haven chapter. So this time we're going to talk about the execution portion of the plan. So we'll talk about scheduling, we'll talk about project control, we'll talk about closure, and yes, in fact, formal closure is required. And then we'll talk about how you handle the ever-present change, because no project ends up being exactly what you had thought it was going to be when you started, because people tend to discover things as they go along and decide that something isn't quite right. And that can be either small changes or huge changes. So anyway, when we talked last time about the WBS, the model that I used is for a house. And we said about WBSs a number of things, one of which is that it needs to be 100% of the included tasks and money. And if you look, there's a series of the internal tasks need to be done inside the house. There's the foundation, there's an external. So what we have at this point is we have somewhere that says how much work needs to be done and how much it's going to cost. But we don't have anything that says in what order are we going to do it. And I will talk more about that in a moment. So you've got, in scheduling the plan, you've got some scheduling methods, you've got project budgeting, and you've got shareholder negotiation or stakeholder negotiation. Any complex project of the size of building a house or building a helicopter or building a submarine or building an airliner are huge, complex projects. And as such, they need something different than an MRP or a master scheduling system, at least initially, to plan them, because you need to have large enough chunks so that you can see how the basic modules fit together. One of the ways we're doing this is program evaluation and review technique, and its partner critical path method, and then the Gantt chart. Does anybody have a guess as to how old these techniques are? If you do, put them in the chat window. Well, they're old. The Gantt chart was developed between 1910 and 1915. CPM came from late World War II and PERT shortly after. It comes out of work done by a group of people in World War II called the Whiz Kids, who invented a world where all decisions could be made based on numbers, an idea that's still used in a lot of MBA programs today. Most famous of these were Robert McNamara, Ted Thornton, Ed Lundy, and R.J. Miller. All 10 of them went on to work for Henry Ford after the end of World War II. Eventually, McNamara became Secretary of Defense under Johnson. Thornton went on to head Litton Industries in the 60s and 70s. Miller was president of Ford and then dean of Stanford's Graduate Business School. And Lundy was Ford's CFO from 67 to 79. But I've happened to find this looking for PERT. And this is September 1958. At that point, it was called Program Evaluation Research Task. And its name changed with the passage of time, but this was happened to find with a little Google search. what I could see about the history of PERT. In scheduling, because you don't, if you remember, the statement of work in the WBS talked about going only to the level necessary to control a chunk of work or a task or a sub-project. So you don't have enough detail generally at that point to generate a real like bill of material lead time linkage. So you need to do some estimating. Under PERT, each activity is assigned pessimistic, most likely, and an optimistic estimate of its duration. Pessimistic, based on the worst case scenario for the activity. Most likely is a realistic assessment, and optimistic is the shortest possible time that you could do it. And then there's a formula commonly used, which is the most optimistic plus 4 times the most likely plus the most pessimistic. So obviously you've got a 60% weighting of the most likely, and then divided by 6. So if a project manager gathers 3 estimates for a task and is told 8, 12, and 9 days, what is the expected time using PERT, using the formula shown below? I will ask you to put your answers into the chat window, and after the responses have died down, Ken will read off what they are.
Yep. Don't be shy, peeps. You want me to start reading them now, John, so you can think about them?
Sure.
Okay, first one was B, second one is D.
Mm-hmm. Everybody else is being bashful.
Very shy. It's a shy crowd. And we won't read who got it wrong, but we can tell you who got it right at the end. Another D.
Okay, so how many Ds do we have?
2 Ds and a B.
Well, if you take that formula, the expected time is 8, which is the most optimistic, plus 4 times 9, plus 12 divided by 6, or 56 divided by 6, or 9.3 days. So the D's had it.
All right. So that was that. There ended up being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 D's while you were talking.
Okay.
So
good.
Yeah, a bunch of people got it right. And
Yep.
if you didn't, you learned.
Pretty simple calculation.
Yeah.
Next, the critical path. The PERT is used to figure out how long an activity is likely to take. Critical path, which is its handmaiden, is used to figure out what order you need to do tasks in once you have the times. So here we have a PERT. We've got task A, task C, task F goes to finish. We go from start to B, D, 6 and finish, and start to B, E and finish. And the question is, once again, what is the critical path out of the ones that I just mentioned? And once again, we take a couple of minutes and fill in the chat window what you think it is.
An A, a C, an A, another A, 3 A's and a C, 4 A's. Oh, we got a B. 4 A's, a B, and a C.
Okay. Well, A, C, F is correct because it's 5 plus 5 plus 6 is 16. B, D, F is 4 plus 1 is 5 plus 6 is 11. And B, E, finish is 4 plus 4 equals 8.
Awesome.
So A was right. Now, what does this look like when you do a really grown-up chart? Well, you've got a series of tasks. In this place, you've got task 10 and task 30. and you've got paths between them. And what you end up is with a network that looks like this, where you've got the goals in a WBS structure going back to what we were looking at a month ago. This might be 2.1, which is pour the foundation. This might be 2.2, which is erect the framing on top of the foundation, et cetera. Each one has a time to it and a particular task. So this is the end game of what you're after. This is the task, and this is the time each takes. So did anybody notice anything interesting about the prior slide? And I'll put it back up again. If you see anything interesting, send a chat to Ken.
I am looking. Guessing people are so intrigued that they're not typing. Stephanie says, Stefan says 2 critical paths. Question mark.
Stefan wins the award.
Yeah, there you go.
Because there are dual critical paths. This is not an unlikely scenario, which will give you an idea of the level of control required to manage a project through this kind of a system, because you've got 2 things that you have to keep your eyes on at the same time. Some comments about those time estimates. They should be based on the WBS. That's what the PERT CPM should be driven by. So that the amount of work should be pretty good. The estimates, I would point out, are only crucial along the critical path. The non-critical paths, it isn't quite so imperative that you hit the target, because at least as far as if you look at the slack in the path, you may have a couple of days, like in the one we saw before, you have a 1 time period, I think it was 1 month slack along the middle path. There is no penalty for being done early. And this is something you get into anytime you're talking about using statistics to manage inventory levels and manage schedules, is the fact there's no early penalty. And you can use normal distribution if you want to see how good the number is. So statistics 101 first week, normal distribution curve, plus or minus 1 standard deviation, 67.3% of the results. And this is a normal distribution. Plus or minus 2 standard deviations, 95.5, plus or minus 3 standard deviations, 99.7. Since as I said earlier, there is no harm for being early, we can ignore this side of the chart, which would be the early. So the only thing we're worried about is the too long path, which leads us to using the numbers that we had before. Here's the 34.14, so 50 plus 34.14 is 84.14 ad nauseum. So we had a PERT estimate of 9.3. 1 standard deviation can be implied as 0.67 because it's the longest was 12, the shortest was 8, divided by 6. So you can be 84% confident it will take less than 10 days, and you can be 98% confident it will take 11 days. And you may factor that in if you wish. Then beyond that, we have this was developed in the other materials, and we just use the Gantt chart, which I will talk about more, as a planning and control tool, particularly which the stuff I showed you last week and this didn't show is as a way of recording task accomplishments. So anyway, once again, this is 100% of the work and 100% of the budget, but it has nothing to do with scheduling. So we can use PERT and CPM to generate the schedule. So let's say it takes 9 months to build a house from start to finish, from when you first put the first blade into the earth to dig the foundation until you pass title to the owner. Say 9 months, 9 months is 39 weeks. 39 weeks is 195 days, 39 times 5. We're probably going to have some holidays. So using percentages, you can calculate how many days it's going to take. And if you use the formulas here, you end up with rounding 191 days. We'd allowed 190. So let's take a closer look at 2.0, which is foundation. And it has two major steps, excavation and framing. There are subtasks for excavate, pour, cure and strip, and for frame studding, beams and joists. I generated this out of project. We'll show you how it all fits together for at least that part. And I think it's fairly obvious that you have to pour the foundation after you're done digging. And you can't take the forms around the poured foundation away until the foundation is cured. Furthermore, I will hypothetically suggest that you can't put the framing on the basement until the basement is poured and cured. So it's obviously 2.1 is followed by 2.2, which is how we worked out the dependencies. So this is what we already had planned. However, there's a whole lot of building the house left to be done. And the question then becomes, how do you arrange the rest of these tasks? Now, I'm not going to bother going into that tonight because there are too many dependencies between, for instance, you probably don't want to start doing anything inside the house until the house is sheathed. You can probably do plumbing and electricity at the same time, but except for the bathrooms, so you have to schedule those. You probably can't start the interior finishing until the plumbing and the electricity is done. You get the idea. Now, when should you develop the project schedule? Before the WBS, so the WBS is based on it, after the WBS, or it depends. Once again, send your thoughts to Ken as A, B, or C.
Monitoring. First one is C. No, we got a B. A CB, not the radio. Another B. So we have two B's and a C. Well, another C. So there's three B's and two C's. Oh, it's now a tie.
Now
three
tie.
C's and three B's.
All right. So let's take a look at it. The correct answer is C, it depends. How can it possibly depend? Well, let's say you're stamping out a housing development and every house that you are building is the same except for where the customer wants to customize. I submit to you, you already know how long it takes to build that house. So you can go ahead and assume that the lead time is going to be the same that it was the last time you built it. However, in the case of the development, at one point you built a spec house. For that, you probably had to do the WBS after you had the plan in place, at least so that you could figure out how long to allow for the first time you build the house. So the answer is a definite maybe. And that's one of those things you have to be aware of. Generally, before you finish the project definition stage, you should have both the WBS and the schedule done. Last thing you have to do is budget. You can use historical information from similar projects, rule of thumb based on experience. We just had an estimate done on replacing the roof on our shed. And I'm sure the estimator came out and used rule of thumb to give us an estimate of what it was going to take based on the size of the shed, because I didn't even see him in the backyard or her in the backyard. And you can, in fact, do it the same way you develop annual standards, imploding it up through a bill of material. You can budget the bottom and accumulate the budget up. And you will probably want to use reserves to take care of possible risks that can come up. Then you need to execute the plan, resolve issues, and negotiate things that where decisions need to be made with the original stakeholders. There can be a whole bunch of challenges around scheduling, particularly a project of the size of building a house. One of the things that will happen is if you had unrealistic estimates of task and resource requirements, imbalances in recourse requirements. You've got one plumber, you're trying to plumb 3 rooms simultaneously. That isn't going to work. Scope changes, and we will come back about the control of scope changes later. And just plain unanticipated events. So there are some tools that you can use to manage schedule changes. The first one is called critical chain, where you insert buffers on the critical path to account for constraints or risks, things like learning curve. That's great, but it lengthens the critical path. Now, in the case of the one that we were looking at before, where 2 legs had the same critical path and the one had the lesser, you may do critical chain on that, or do critical chain before you set the process schedule in stone. Critical chain is an offshoot of the Ellie Goldratt's work in theory of constraints. And I think Dave and I talked about that once. Source smoothing, insert slack time between activities to allow for constraints. You don't change the end date. Resource leveling, just schedule to account for resource constraints. For instance, the plumber and 3 rooms. If you have 6 days work and you've only got half time that it can be done, then you've got 12 days of elapsed time. Crashing, adding resources to expand capacity. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. My favorite example is that just because one woman can have 1 or more babies in 9 months does not imply that 9 women can have the baby in 1 month. So you need to be aware of that, and that may increase project cost. Run activities in parallel. If that's planned, that's fine. If it wasn't planned initially, it increases the project risk, and it may also impact quality. Now, scope creep. I'm sure you have all seen scope increase on projects. And I will tell you this, that the less rigorous job you do on preparing this project plan, WBS project schedule up front, the more possibility you will have for scope creep as the things that you didn't think of are uncovered. And there are some other tools for doing this, which I will not get into here. Informal addition of unfunded features and services. The users, the stakeholders love to say things like, oh, by the way, while you're in there, couldn't you just add this? And a lot of times in the past, and I'm going back to the past of the 60s and 70s, we were being nice people and we said, sure, we can go ahead and do that. And we ended up over budget and over schedule, i.e. past due. And guess who took the hit for that? It was the people who had agreed, not the requesters who wanted some additions. So what you have to do is have a formal scope change procedure in place that talks about what is required to change the scope of a project. You need a change request made. Project manager reviews it and forwards for analysis where you get additional budget, additional time, et cetera, manpower, et cetera. Change control analyzes it. You may, in fact, need to go to a senior management, particularly if it requires additional funding. Decision is made, and then the changes are made to the project documentation. Then you have to monitor and control the plan. The way that and manage changes, the way that you do that is through variance analysis. In this chart, we've got 3 lines. Up here, you've got a project reserve and then the total for the project. And notice that the PV, which is the planned value, is the solid line, in fact, can be filled out all the way to the end of the project because that's how much you plan to spend. The gray line, which is a cumulative cost, is how much you are actually spending. The dotted line is how much you've earned. So as of this point in time, we have worked from Q1 through Q4, and we should have spent, we should have produced $300,000 worth of labor on the project, but we have only, in fact, produced $250,000 worth of labor on the project. So it compares actual to planned and provides warning, but it requires truthful status reports. Now we got a couple of things going on here. How do you explain the actual cost being greater than the planned projected value and the earned value being less? Project has hit a snag. People are working more hours, but not getting anywhere. I was doing a project for a major defense contractor. We were putting in a new shop floor control system. The project had been planned very carefully. The software we thought was a risk, but the 2 hardware vendors were both well established, had worked together before, and we assumed would not be a problem. Well, as luck would have it, the 2 hardware vendors caused a problem. They couldn't communicate with each other. They reached loggerheads and said it was impossible for them to implement the software design. So we threw them out, hired another organization, and started over. You can imagine what happened to accumulated cost, earned value, and planned value through all of that. That was the biggest project change order I have ever worked on. Can earned value and planned value be the same and accumulated cost greater than either? If you use more expensive resources, that would be one way of doing that. Let's say that you had planned for, you're doing an IT project, you had planned for a programmer to work 15 hours on something. The programmer was out sick, so a senior systems analyst did the work. They have a higher labor rate, spend more money, even though the amount of labor you had projected and earned stays the same. So those are a couple of things that you will find if you work with this long enough. And then, I don't know if you can see right here, but there is a bar down the middle of the blue, and there is a bar down the middle of the red. This is Microsoft Project, and it is possible to report percentage complete and hours worked through tools that are included in Microsoft Project. And if you do that, then your project plan, your Gantt chart can show percentages of completion, which can then support the accumulated cost, the planned value, and the earned value. Yeah. And sign off. Closing the plan, you need to get customer sign off on deliverables. The reason that's important is so that they cannot come back at some later point and say, well, you didn't do everything that was required. You have to close and document what you did. Stress the documentation. You have got to know, you have got to accumulate every piece of paper, be they physical pieces of paper or virtual pieces of paper that you collected and put it together in the project folder, so that anybody else can go back at any point in time and figure out why decisions were made concerning the project. And documentation is one of those things that people generally don't leave a lot of time for when they're doing the project plan, but is absolutely critical. And that's the only way you can support organizational learning. Closing includes contractual and administrative closure. Contractuals with client sign off on all deliverables. Administrative closure is completing and archiving project related documentation. Closing of suppliers and supplier subcontracts, and the supplier relationship will be assessed. Audits may be held to make sure of the thoroughness of the closure documents. And a team debrief will be held to figure out how to improve the project planning and execution process, so that if you undertake another process of the same complexity at some point in the future, you will be able to go back and say, this is what we learned the last time we did this. So we talked about scheduling, we talked about controlling, we talked about closure, we talked about changes. As we said the last time, having robust project management won't guarantee project success, but not having it will guarantee project failure. Questions?
I am watching things.